and then of course the insects themselves. And so just you can see in this grid here, insects are really amazing. You know, I guess I'm biased. I went and got my PhD in insects, but they are truly amazing organisms and oftentimes overlooked. People don't realize how fascinating they are. Just looking at this photo, you can see such a wide range of colors and bodies and appendages and life cycles and natural history. And so obviously we're going to go over a lot today, but be excited. They're really fascinating. So within Arthropoda, now we have the insects that we're going to be talking about. And so shared characteristics across all insects, which again, going back to this picture, they are super diverse. So but what is shared between them is that they have a 3-part body. So a head, thorax, and abdomen. We'll go over the body a lot more later. 3 pairs of jointed legs. Compound eyes. We'll go into some details about their eyes in a bit. 1 pair of antennae. 2 pairs of wings. A ventral nervous system. And an open circulatory system. So where we have a heart that sort of pumps everything around their body, they sort of everything just sort of sloshes around inside of insects. Now, one thing I do want to make a note of here is that even though these are all characteristics of insects, there are many insects out there that have specialized to such a specific degree that they've essentially, some of these body parts are so reduced that they basically don't exist anymore. One good example is all flies, the order Diptera. So you think of maybe a horsefly or a mosquito or a housefly. They do have 2 pairs of wings, but the back wing doesn't really look like a wing. It's called a haltere. We'll go over that later, and it's specialized. They're so good at flying. They instead of having a second pair of wings over time, they evolved that second pair of wing to be more like a gyroscope, so they can fly really fast and be able to turn in the air. So some insects may not have some of these things anymore, but they did at one point, and sort of it evolved away as they became more specialized. Here's a super generic general photo of drawing of an insect showing some of the major body parts. So as I said before, the insect is broken up into 3 large segments. The head, let me turn on my little laser pointer. That's right here. Can everybody see that? Should work.
Yep, we can see it.
Yes.
Great. So this is the head and the thorax. So the thorax is going to have 3 legs. A fun game to play after learning a lot about insects is to go out to any store that has maybe like a mug with an insect on it and see how many times you can see the legs on the wrong part of the body. It's kind of funny. And then the abdomen. And so the wings and the legs are always going to be on the thorax. And then on the abdomen, you're going to have the majority of the organs and the reproductive organs. So digging a little deeper in the head, you're going to have the mouth parts, which are broken up into so many different parts. We'll talk about those. Kind of a cool fact about the mouth parts, actually. So the evolutionary thought when it comes to insects is that insects probably evolved from something that looked a little bit more like a centipede with a lot more legs. And what they thought is that over evolutionary time, the legs towards the front of the body became more and more specialized and eventually became all of the different mouth parts. Their mouth parts aren't just an opening. Each mouth part has a specialization and has kind of a different job and moves independently. Then you're going to have the antenna, which insects use both for kind of smelling. So there's going to be lots of little hairs on the antenna and lots of little pores. I always kind of say that insects are almost like chemically driven little robots. They really use smell for pretty much everything, for orientation, for finding mates, for finding places to lay their eggs. Some insects with larger eyes use vision too, but smell is really important for all insects. Then you're going to have 2 large compound eyes and also the ocelli. So if you didn't know this, insects actually, this ocelli is a third eye, and it's simplified and tends to, the thought is that it's used for perceiving light and dark. And so light and dark, the ratio of light to dark is very important to insects in several different life stages, as this can indicate the time of the year, and when emergence is supposed to happen. So the thought is that the ocelli is part of the insect, of course, when it's an adult flying around, but insects may be able to use this also even when they're in their egg stage developing, to just be able to tell light and dark. It's very sensitive to that. Then you're going to have a forewing and a hind wing. And again, sometimes these wings are modified, and we'll be going over that later. And then the cerci and the reproductive organs, which are all part of reproduction and laying eggs and sensing. Finally, you'll see spiracles here. Does anyone in the room know what spiracles are for? So spiracles are the breathing organ. So insects don't breathe out of their mouth like we do. They have little holes through their whole body, and that has to do with that open, like they don't have blood pumping through their whole body. The oxygen diffuses into the blood throughout their whole body. When insects molt, what's kind of fascinating is if you can find exuviae is what a molted insect sort of shell is called. If you can find a exuviae of a larger insect, you can examine it. They actually molt all the way down into their spiracle. Their chitin is all the way down, their exoskeleton's all the way down inside of their body. So when they kind of pull off that exoskeleton, they actually pull off a lot of that spiracle with it too. So it's kind of neat. So this is a drawing of a stink bug. And just to get into a little bit more detail here, A, again, the section is the head, B is the thorax, and C is the abdomen. I'm going to go kind of counterclockwise or clockwise here through these numbers. So 1 through 4 are giving information about insect
Excuse me,
legs.
Hillary, are we going
Yep.
to get a copy of your slideshow, or do we need to try to write all this down?
I think I think that you have access to this in your online. Is that right?
Yes, yes, we will
Okay,
be giving
great.
them a copy of the slideshow. So yes, you will have
Okay,
it.
thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot to learn.
Now I can listen more instead of trying to copy things. Yeah.
Yes, and I will throw in here that you know, things that are on the screen and in the notes that come with this presentation are what you're going to be wanting to know. I'm also adding in a lot of anecdotes that I know and think are really interesting to make the whole thing more fun. So you definitely, no one here needs to feverishly be taking notes. Unless that's how you learn, and then that's perfectly fine too. I'm a feverish note person. I can't help myself. So 1 is showing the claws. 2 is the tarsus, which is sort of like the foot. 3 is the tibia, and 4 is the femur. So all of the legs will have those terms. And the reason, just like humans and going to the doctor, where we all have, each bone has its own name, the reason that these segments are all named is that when you're identifying insects, oftentimes it might boil down to for, you know, genus differentiation with insects, it might boil down to counting the number of hairs on the claw, which you won't be doing in this course, but just that's why there's so many terms. All right, so that's the leg. 8, this right here is showing that compound eye again. 9 are showing the antenna. 10 is showing the clypeus. All right, now we're going down to 23. These are called, along the edge here, the laterotergites. 25, this section here is called the pronotum. On many insects, this pronotum sort of pokes over the head a little bit, so it's sort of like a protective for the insect's head. 26, this is the scutellum, which is sort of oftentimes a little structure kind of right between the wings. Let me just see. So 28 is, if you look right here, on these types of insects, true bugs or hemipterans, this is called the corium, a wing cover. So they have sort of a leathery wing cover. And then 30 here is a wing membrane. This is showing different terms on a beetle. So before we had a true bug, and now we have a beetle. So a true bug, they're hemipterans, and beetles are coleopterans. And they actually have, they're quite far apart evolutionarily, but they've sort of evolved to have some similar traits that I'll point out back and forth between these two slides. But again, we see the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. The beetles often have antennae that come right out the front, and their mouth parts are usually chewing. Most beetles, or many beetles, are predatory. Many beetles are herbivorous, but they both use chewing mouth parts. The abdomen, where the wings are, or sorry, the thorax, so the wings are, something really cool about beetles, their forewing has evolved to not be a flying structure, but instead a protective structure. And so what is good for beetles with this protective forewing is that they're able to exist in rough terrain, like crawling under rocks and crawling under leaf litter, and really getting into different plants and things like that without getting their wings that they use for flying all torn up. The kind of flip side of this is, by having this forewing be really hardened, beetles are not really the strongest flyers. They may be able to fly for long distances, but they're not going to be as graceful as, say, a dragonfly or a true fly. Their wings will, they'll lift up those forewings, those elytra, and then unfold their back wings and then use those to fly. I'm sure if you've ever seen any kind of beetle taking off, you've kind of seen this happen. It's really cool. Again, here's that scutellum. It's smaller on this beetle between these two wings, the tibia, tarsus, and claws. And so just going back, you can see that this stink bug here sort of has a similar thing going on. So it has the forewings with a leathery hardened area. So they're likely to, their behavior is likely that they're also going to get into some sort of harder to get into type of situations, but maybe not quite as tough as beetles with the super, super tough elytra. This is showing a cockroach. So in this situation, you can see that both their forewing and their hind wing are not hardened. They have larger wings. And again, you can see the head, the antenna, the compound eye. They have something called a prothorax. Sometimes the terms can get a little complicated. Different insect groups, different orders will have specialists over time and taxonomists within them that sometimes change these terms up, or different insects, different areas might be more important for the identification, differentiating between different species. So sometimes you'll get slightly different terms that go into a little more detail. So for example, with thorax here, this has the pro, meso, and meta. Pro means sort of the front, meso's middle, and meta is back. So in comparison to the beetle here, the thorax is just being talked about as one region because it's basically just one big segment. There's not much going on. But on this cockroach here, there's a lot more going on in the thorax. You have a front area, a middle area, and a back area. And so that's just that to show that, you know, again, insects are very diverse and there's going to be different terms for different things. The cerci, which again is a sensory organ, you can kind of think about them, not to be crass, but you can kind of think of them as butt antenna. They sense a lot of different things. The abdomen, and again, this is showing fore, mid, and hind, the fore leg, the mid leg, and the hind leg. Here's a side view of a grasshopper. Again, you can see the head, the thorax, and so you know it's the thorax all the way back to here because it contains the wings and it contains the legs, and then the abdomen. This palp right here, that's a term for one of the types of mouth parts. So can't you even see here on this grasshopper, that palp, that mouth part, almost looks like a tiny leg. That's one of my favorite insect facts, that they probably evolved from having all these legs to this super cool head with these specialized antenna that maybe were once a leg, and mouth parts that were probably once legs. Everything else is pretty much the same here. A new term here is ovipositor. That's the word for the female egg-laying structure. All insects have ovipositors. Most of the time, they're used for laying eggs. In social insects, such as yellow jackets and honeybees, where there are different castes, you're able, instead of using it to lay eggs when there's a queen, it over time evolved to be specialized as stingers. So the stinger is actually a modified egg-laying structure. So why are insects so successful? And by successful, that term comes from the fact that there are millions, probably, species. We have a certain number of species that have been defined, but there's so many things that, we still haven't, as humans, been able to even know exist. Insects are so biodiverse. Insects have a high reproductive rate, which means that they are highly fertile. They can lay eggs either multiple times, or they lay a lot of eggs at once, or sometimes they'll lay a lot of eggs all at once. For example, there's a moth species that I'm working with this summer, and a single female will typically lay up to 600 eggs. They mature very rapidly. With fruit flies that can be within a week, they go through their full life cycle. So not only are many being produced at once, they also mature very rapidly, and depending on the species, can have several generations just in 1 year. The ability to fly and disperse can help them find different food sources, can help them navigate to new environments when where they are currently staying isn't working out. They're highly adaptable, both again in their ability to have many generations in a year. Evolutionarily, they can adapt. This is seen oftentimes with the overuse of one pesticide. You can have a very, very quickly developed resistance to that pesticide, where the insects that sort of hobbled away and survived through a spray event ultimately mate and reproduce again, and quickly you'll have a new population that's able to have that trait of surviving that pesticide. Also, sort of within their genetics, oftentimes they're able to adapt. There are species that can sort of go into sort of a winter morph. They molt and then they can survive the winter better. They're fascinating. They're small, which can have lots of benefits in the world. Needing less food, being able to fit into smaller places, being able to differentiate and, be on different animals. For example, with lice, there are different life species for most different mammals, for example. So that small size kind of gives them a bigger world to exist in. Metamorphosis. So this is something we'll talk about more later, but metamorphosis is when you think of a caterpillar, so like a butterfly that has an egg, and then a caterpillar, and then a cocoon, and then an adult. Insects are split up into holo and holometabolous and I'm totally blanking here. And hemimetabolous are two splits. And again, we'll go like over this later with slides anyways, but there's sort of some keystone areas in the evolution of insects where once a trait happens, the diversity just explodes. And so metamorphosis is one of those keystone regions. And sort of one of the theories is that by having your life cycle split up that way, you're able to have a sort of baby stage, per se, like caterpillars, that feed on one thing, like leaves on a tree, and then an adult stage that feeds on something else, like flower nectar. And so within one species, the adults and the babies aren't even competing for the same resource. Insect wings are super diverse. They might have 1 or 2 pairs of wings. Again, as I mentioned before, the insects that quote unquote have 1 wing really do have 2, but it's been specialized. So again, beetles are going to have a specialized forewing that kind of protects them. They're kind of little tanks. Flies are going to have a hind wing that's evolved to be more like a gyroscope. Wasps and ants have 2 pairs of wings, but they have a cool feature where they have these hooks called hannuli where they kind of click together. So they kind of become like 1 big wing. Really neat stuff. The texture, as we've talked about a little bit already, can be all across the board. For example, hemipterans and orthopterans, so true bugs and grasshoppers and katydids, have a leathery forewing, which allows some protection to that important hind wing. Hard, like beetles, membranous, like dragonflies, or even scaly, like butterflies and moths. The shape can be elongate, rounded, or triangular. And the position at rest also can vary. So you have dragonflies, which all rest with their wings out. They might have a sheath that's encasing the whole body. The wings might be upright over the body, lay out to the sides, or be roof-like or overlapped. Mouth parts are super varied, and obviously they're tied into the types of food that they eat. So butterflies have long tubes that are like straws for sucking. Those are called sucking mouth parts. Bees have lapping mouth parts. So it's not exactly like a tube. They use some of their other mouth parts almost like a tongue to lick up and bring things up into their bodies. Insects that are herbivores, eating plant matter, and also predators will have chewing mouth parts a lot of the time. So you'll have big incisors. And then just here's some more examples here. So bees have lapping mouth parts. Houseflies also have lapping mouth parts. It's kind of gross for houseflies. They actually regurgitate up some of essentially their stomach acid and digest whatever they're sitting on, and then they sponge up what's been kind of pre-digested. This again with chewing, we have grasshopper down on the bottom. So this is an example of a beetle up top with really sharp predatory teeth, and a grasshopper down bottom with teeth that are sort of more designed for chewing plant matter, although oftentimes grasshoppers and katydids are sort of omnivores. And then cicadas also have that sucking mouth part. As I sort of mentioned before, insects can be herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, and scavengers. And many insects that may, primarily be an herbivore really are omnivores and will take opportunities. A really good example that really surprised me when I was doing my graduate work on the brown marmorated stink bug, I was trying to figure out how many stink bug eggs in managed orchards were getting consumed by predators and parasitoids before hatching to get an idea of how management practices affected these things. And a lot of the eggs, I would put out stink bug eggs out in the orchard. I'd literally like pinned them to leaves and came back 2 days later to see what happened to them. And a lot of them had predation events on them. And turns out that katydids, which are cousins to grasshoppers, were eating a lot of those eggs. Insects are super diverse. So this pie graph here, which is modified from the University of California Museum of Paleontology, shows different groups of insects. So beetles make up 22% of the species that are described, more than 350,000 described species. Flies make up 9%. Wasps make up 8%. So wasps are in the order Hymenoptera, and it's my favorite order. I think that the difficult thing with wasps are they are very underrepresented. There are many species of wasps that are smaller than a poppy seed, and so they're very challenging to identify, oftentimes needing, you can't even tell them apart without either DNA or dissecting out the genitalia. And so even when I was in grad school, someone I knew in grad school was working on this very specific tiny group of wasps, and she went through a bunch of old museum specimens and found out that one species actually became like 16 different species. So wasps probably should take up a bigger slice of this pie here. Butterflies and moths are about 7%. And then, oh, and I'm sorry, this is not all of insects. This is the percentages of all described species on the planet. So if you look here, I'm going to tracing more than half of the described species on the planet are insects. Insects are so successful. Otherwise, you have 18% that are plants and algae, 4% that are fungi, probably also super underdescribed. Other invertebrates at 12%, and then us vertebrates only make up 1% of the species. So we're living in a diverse planet, that's for sure. Insects make up 59% of described species. Sadly, you may have heard in the news that there is concern that there's a decline in the number of insects. This 2014 paper that was published in Science, which is a really well-respected journal. It's hard to get in that journal, so a lot of work was done for this paper, showed a 45% decline in invertebrate populations over the past 40 years. This is really sad and probably due to many factors happening at once: loss of habitat, overuse of pesticides, especially in, sort of before the days of Rachel Carson and the EPA. These days, pesticides are much more well regulated, but I think sometimes there's some work to do in some areas. One of the big things I do at my job is educating a lot of different folks on preventative means before turning to pesticides first. The flying insect abundance has fallen by 75% since 1989 in this study in PLOS 1 from Germany. And, this is really concerning as insects are of significant ecological importance all across different regions, including being the major part of the food web for many other organisms. That oftentimes they can form, one of the early parts of the food web. Many insects are pollinators beyond bees. Everyone thinks pollinator, and the first thing that pops in your head is a honeybee, and honeybees are great. Technically, honeybees are kind of the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, is technically livestock. And so, beyond Apis mellifera, the honeybee that you think of, we have lots of species of native bees and bumblebees, and also flies and wasps that all pollinate, some moths and butterflies too. Insects are important for seed dispersal, maintaining the soil structure and the fertility of the soil. They do a lot of decomposition, and biological control and ecological balance of other organisms. When systems are disrupted, sometimes, if say a pesticide is sprayed and it seems like everything is dead, the things that we view as pests actually pop back faster than the other things that were controlling those insects by having a balance in ecology. So when that ecological balance is thrown off, a lot of problems can happen down the line. And these are just some interesting statistics from the Xerces Society that insects do for us. For example, wild natural enemies like ladybugs protect more than $4.5 billion in crop production in the US alone. Beetles and other, this is a dung beetle here. They clean up grazing lands, saving ranchers more than $380 million to help retain nutrients. If on the Humane Extension website, I actually found a great article. They also, dung beetles in blueberry fields here in Maine, remove deer dung from the blueberry fields and help to keep blueberries that we eat cleaner. When it rains, you won't have that poop kind of splashing up on the plants because the dung beetles do a great job taking it away. Native pollinators contribute at least $3 billion in pollination services, and they also contribute $22 billion to recreation industry as food for wildlife. So insects are important to us and important just in the fact that they are beings sharing this planet with us too. Some different things to think about with the cross section of insects and humans. Across the world, even if it sounds strange to you, different cultures use insects as food both directly by cooking and consuming or indirectly. So insects will feed the livestock that they eat. On the negative side, oftentimes insects become agricultural pests that reduce the quality and amount of crops. But on the plus side, insects oftentimes are biocontrol for those agricultural pests and also for insects that are potentially causing disease. Insects can be disease vectors, which is near and dear to our hearts here in Maine, both with some of the different mosquito-borne illnesses that you can catch here in Maine and also the dreaded Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. Insects have been used for many, many years historically in the production of silk and in the production of shellac, and also in medicine, dyes, art, and in mythology. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the reproductive cycles of insects. So I mentioned before the holometabolous and hemimetabolous, also known as, so holometabolous insects have complete metamorphosis, and hemimetabolous insects have incomplete metamorphosis. And so the way I like to think of incomplete metamorphosis is it's sort of like us, like they have a cute little baby that looks kind of like the adult. And so they'll lay eggs and then they have a cute little baby that's teeny tiny and it will feed and molt several times. 5 seems to be sort of an average, but different insects will molt different times. They'll feed and molt, and each time they molt, they look a little bit more like the adult. In the final molt, they'll have typically they'll have their full wings, so they don't have the ability to fly until they're an adult, and also they'll have their reproductive organs. Complete metamorphosis, instead, there'll be an egg that will hatch into a tiny larva. The larval stage goes through all the molting until it gets to a final molt where it pupates, and sort of within that pupa, it molts and things dissolve and reorganize, and then it comes back out as an adult. So as I mentioned before, one of the very amazing things about this complete metamorphosis is that the young stage, the larval stage, is able to look completely different from the adult stage and have a completely different food that it eats and life history. Some of my favorite insects are aquatic, so like dragonflies. As the immature stages, as the larva, they live a fully aquatic life, and then when they molt as adults, they fly away. I think that's so cool. You can also see here just a few little different terms. So in both types of metamorphosis, you have egg is the same, but in insects that have complete, it's typically called either a larva, or in the case of beetles, a maggot, and flies often are also called maggots, but they're called larvae or maggots, whereas the young stages of incomplete metamorphosis insects are called nymphs. And then pupa just only exists in the complete metamorphosis, and then adults are the same. So if you ever hear someone talking about a nymph, they're talking about one of the insect orders that are incomplete metamorphosis, and larvae are complete metamorphosis. So incomplete metamorphosis is going to be simple, gradual, and these are those hemimetabolous, as I mentioned. So this shows a cousin to the stink bug. This is a wheel bug, I think. This shows the egg, and then the little baby. It's so cute. It looks just like a tiny version of the adult with little teeny spots that'll one day be wings. Gets a little bigger. I tell people my cute meter is broken. I haven't seen an insect that I didn't think was cute. gets bigger, bigger. You see the wing pads developing. And in the last larval instar, the wing pads are much larger and sort of underneath inside of the body, the actual wings and reproductive organs are starting to form. So when they molt that last time, the wings are already there. And so that's how things grow on insects. They on the inside, whatever's coming next is already growing inside of the insect as it's moving around. Down at the University of New Hampshire, Dr. Istvan Miko runs the insect collection there and does some very fascinating, really important, basic research that not many folks do anymore, where he will dissect out insects and take some really high resolution photos of what's going on with the connections between their muscles and the wings and the development. And he's uncovering so much cool information still that we just don't know about with insects. For Maine Entomological Society, we had him do an insect morphology course 2 years ago, and it was I learned so much. It was so cool. So highly recommend checking that out when we do those winter workshops. Complete metamorphosis, again, I always give the butterfly as an example because everyone's typically pretty familiar with that. So you're going to have the egg, it's going to hatch into a larva, and you're going to have lots and lots of molts, usually around 5, before they go into this pupal stage. Depending on the organism, the pupa might be, the typical caterpillar thing where you kind of see it hanging on a leaf, or this is sort of the toughest stage, like the most protected stage. So many insects that are complete metamorphosis will overwinter under the leaf litter as pupa, and then they emerge as adults. So these are the orders that Maine master naturalists need to know. The Coleoptera are the beetles. The Diptera are the flies. The Hemiptera are the true bugs. Hymenoptera include the bees. Hymenoptera is bees, ants, wasps, and sawflies. Lepidoptera are the butterflies and moths. Odonata are the dragonflies and damselflies. And Orthoptera are the grasshoppers and katydids. Other orders that you don't need to know, but you should know anyways because they're cool, include Pseucoptera, so book lice, Dermaptera, earwigs, Trichoptera, caddisflies. This is one of those groups that are aquatic as larvae. Blatodia, which are the cockroaches, Neuroptera, which are the lacewings, and Thysanoptera, which are the thrips. So at this point, you, I believe, have some insect sets. And this is a generic photo of what they should look like. A is going to be an orthopteran. B is going to be a beetle or a coleopteran. C is going to be some sort of fly or a dipteran. D is going to be Hemiptera or a true bug. E will be Hymenoptera, likely a bee, I think. F will be some kind of butterfly, a lepidopteran. G will be an odonate, which is a dragonfly or a damselfly. And H is going to be an exuviae of a nymph, so a shed skin of a nymph. So look how cool that is. Isn't that awesome that the dragonfly nymph is so different from the adult? Okay, so I'm assuming since you're all home, you probably have your insect sets.
They should.
Okay, great. So I'll take a minute break here and just let folks, if they need to run and grab their insect sets.
Can you go back to the last page so we can write down the
Sure.
Thanks.
Okay. Is everybody ready to move on? Hearing nothing, I'm going to move on. Okay, now we are going to delve into the orders. Just as a reminder, I'm sure you've heard the different terms a lot in the class, but sort of the way the kingdom is broken down is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And one thing that I don't feel like gets talked about enough with insects is that depending on the order, if you catch something and you go to identify it, you may be able to get all the way down to species, like if you have a big chonky grasshopper or a butterfly or a big characteristic beetle. But sometimes it's much more challenging than that. And depending on the group of insects, it might only be realistic to get to the order or the family, sometimes the genus, but unless it's a really large characteristic insect, some of the smaller things are really challenging to get to species. So I just always like it was something I learned myself when I was kind of going through learning entomology, that I had these, when I did my undergraduate honors thesis, I had these visions of grandeur of identifying thousands of different insects to species. And I ended up spending 3 months at the Smithsonian with the world specialist on Burkhanid wasps and didn't even get all of those to species. So it can be really time consuming and really challenging. Okay, so this large table here shows the number of insect species per order. Again, this is going to be what we know, what we have identified, not the reality of what's actually out there. There's probably lots of unidentified insects. So the orders are all the way on the left, and then the common names of the orders, the numbers of species, and I believe the percentage of all insects. So up top, we've got coleopterans. Those are the beetles with somewhere around, I think, 380,000 species. The zoom top is blocking off that one for me, but that's somewhere around, I think, 38% of insects that have been identified. Next are the butterflies and the moths with about 157,000 species. Flies also with about 150,000. Hymenoptera with 116. And then something really cool that I love pointing out here is, remember I mentioned the complete metamorphosis and how that was sort of a keystone explosion in biodiversity. Biodiversity meaning how many species there are within a given group. So this square right here, Hymenoptera, Diptera, Lepidoptera, and Coleoptera, they all have complete metamorphosis. So you can see that the insects with complete metamorphosis have so many more species within their orders than the insects below. Next up are hemipterans. So those are the true bugs, the cicadas, the aphids, and the leafhoppers with about 100,000. And then 20,000 for the grasshoppers, locusts, and crickets, 14,000 for those caddisflies, and then somewhere between 1 and 5,000 for the rest of the different orders. So Blatodia are the cockroaches and termites, Odonata are the dragonflies and damselflies, Neuroptera, the lacewings and the antlions, Thysanoptera, the thrips, Socophora, the book lice, bark lice, and barkflies, Theraptera, the lice, Plecoptera, the stoneflies. Stoneflies and mayflies are both aquatic, and so on and so forth. Kind of interesting too, these 9 minor orders together, which come together all to be 3,600 species. Silverfish, bristletails, Dobson flies, and scorpion flies are some of the oldest evolutionary species. So like millions and millions of years ago, sort of the first insects to have evolved as insects. And so there are fewer species because as time goes on, different orders have kind of evolved that become more specialized. And as they become specialized and do cooler things like in complete metamorphosis, they're able to diversify and be more successful. So this is just showing the set again. So does anybody remember of these orders here, which one has the most described species? Chat. This is the beetles. The beetles. Okay, so let's talk about them. So here's just some examples of different cool things about beetles. So as I talked about before, they have these hardened front wings, and they're going to meet in a straight line right down the back. The hind wings are going to be membranous, and they fold underneath these four wings that are hardened, which are called elytra. They have chewing mouth parts, and they go through complete metamorphosis. So for beetles, they'll lay eggs. Those eggs will hatch into grubs. Those grubs will pupate, and then they'll emerge as adults. Here's a few common beetles that you may have heard of. Ladybugs, the emerald ash borer, which is a concerning invasive species, fireflies, and ground beetles. One thing that's kind of cool about fireflies is their forewings are a bit more leathery. I'm sure that part of it is that it helps, you know, the light when they shine it to come through. But just out of all the different beetles, they have quite leathery wings. The dipterans are the flies. They have one obvious pair of wings. Then they have those reduced wings, which I mentioned before. Those are called halteres. They're to aid in balance when they fly. They either have lapping mouth parts, like this fly here, or sort of if you think of like a big, this is like a big blowfly. It's really gross when they land on your food because sometimes they landed on poop before that. Or they'll have piercing. So if you think a piercing fly that we all love here in Maine is our mosquitoes. And they also have complete metamorphosis. So flies they lay their eggs, and those hatch into maggots, and then they pupate, and then they come out as adults. Some examples of flies include the mosquito, the black fly, the crane fly, which is not a giant mosquito. It's its own group of flies, and it doesn't even bite humans at all, and the deer fly. Then we have the order Hemiptera. If you are looking in some older books and texts, you might see Hemiptera and Homoptera as two different orders, but at some point they were combined just into one order, Hemiptera. And this has lots and lots of different insects, including aphids, leaf hoppers, and cicadas. This is a photo here of a brown marmorated stink bug, which is the invasive species that I worked on during my PhD. They almost always have two pairs of wings, and oftentimes the forewing is leathery modified. They have piercing or sucking mouth parts. They go through incomplete metamorphosis, so they have little ones that hatch that molt over time, and the final molt goes right into adulthood. And again, there used to be Hemiptera and Homoptera, and they're now just one order, Hemiptera, but there's a subgroup called Heteroptera, where the front wings overlap, where they're half leathery and half membranous. So the stink bug here fits into that group Heteroptera. And Homoptera, which again used to be its own order, but now it's just sort of a subgroup within Hemiptera, they have all membranous wings that are held tent-like over their body. So a leafhopper is an example of Homoptera. See how their wings sort of are tent-like over the body, and they're fully membranous. So some examples of insects in the order Hemiptera include the giant water bug, which some people call toe biters, the leafhopper, the aphid, and the cicada. Hemipterans make up a large percentage of insects that are pests agriculturally. Then you have the order Hymenoptera, which includes the bees, the wasps, the ants, and also sawflies, which sometimes they're sort of the oldest evolutionary along the line and the least diverse, but they are also Hymenopterans. They're going to have two pairs of membranous wings. that hook together with those little hooks I talked about that kind of go like that. Those are called hamuli. They often may be wingless as well. For example, in social castes like ants, they won't have wings. Sometimes they have them and then rip them off. The front wings are going to be larger with a few veins. The antenna will have 10 or more segments, and the mouth parts will either be adapted for chewing or sucking nectar. They have complete metamorphosis, so they lay eggs, and then they have larvae, then they pupate, and then they become adults. These are a few examples of different insects in the order Hymenoptera. This is that European honeybee, Apis mellifera, that humans have cultivated for a very long time for honey. This is an ant. This is a paper wasp. And this is a parasitoid. This is my favorite group of insects, is all the parasitoid wasps. So this is an ichneummonid wasp, and she will lay her egg directly into a caterpillar, where it will feed on the caterpillar from the inside out, and that's that life cycle. So parasitoid wasps are, sometimes they'll parasitize, some species parasitize the caterpillar stage, the larval stage. Some species parasitize the egg stage. Some species lay their eggs on an adult. They have lots of different life histories, but they're very interesting, and many are used for biocontrol of other organisms. Then we have the order Lepidoptera, which include the butterflies and moths. They have 2 pairs of scaled covered wings. They go through complete metamorphosis. So with lepidopterans, you have an egg, a caterpillar, a pupa, or sometimes they're called chrysalis, and an adult. Oftentimes the adults are non-feeding, or they do feed just on sort of the sugar, on the nectar. And typically caterpillars are leaf feeders. It shows 4 species: the black swallowtail butterfly, the rosy maple moth, the clouded sulfur, and our super fun special friend here in Maine, the brown-tail moth. So this is what the adult of the brown-tail moth looks like. I have to say, this is the time of year that if you have lights that you keep on outside of your homes or your businesses, I strongly recommend you either have those lights on a timer or to have them off at this time of the year. They'll attract the brown-tail moth nearby to your trees, where they'll lay eggs and have horrible itchy caterpillars next year. Some of the differences between a butterfly and moth. Butterflies are mostly diurnal, so they're usually flying around during the day, whereas moths are mostly nocturnal, flying at night. Butterflies have their pupa in chrysalis, which will typically be hanging from a leaf, whereas the pupa of moths are oftentimes in silken cocoons. Butterfly antennae are typically long and thread-like, or have a club on them, whereas moth antennae are usually combed or feathery. The wings of butterflies are oftentimes closed at rest, whereas moths are open at rest. I actually think that's swapped. If you look at the photos here, the butterfly at rest is open and the moth is closed. And then finally, the eyes will be in sort of different places. So you can see these eyes are on the side of the head, where oftentimes moth eyes you can't even see because their heads kind of hide under their fluff, but they're more towards the front. All right, next is the order Orthoptera, which includes grasshoppers and crickets. The front wings are going to be leathery or parchment-like, sometimes veined. The hind wings are going to be membranous, and they're going to be broad. And so when they're at rest, they're kind of folded like a fan, and then when they go to fly, they open them up. The hind legs are enlarged for jumping. They're going to have chewing mouth parts and have incomplete metamorphosis. This shows a grasshopper on the top and a katydid on the bottom. Next are dragonflies and damselflies. This photo here shows a damselfly. They're going to have 2 pairs of membranous wings. very large compound eyes. So dragonflies and damselflies are one of the insect orders that does rely quite heavily on vision over their sense of smell. So they're visual hunters. They have long, slender bodies. They have biting or chewing mouthparts, and they go through incomplete metamorphosis, with the larval stage being underwater and then emerging as adults above the water. Here's just a few examples: the eastern pond hawk, the spread-winged damselfly, and the 12-spotted skimmer. And again, I'm camping with my family this week at Sebago Lake, and I was floating around today with a spread-winged damselfly on me, so kind of fun. And then here's just some other insect orders that we're not going to be getting into today. These include the caddisflies, order Trichoptera. Caddisflies are aquatic as young, and then as adults they fly. The lacewings and antlions, or the neuropterans, even though it looks really delicate and dainty, these are actually voracious predators, and the larval stage are really, really great generalist predators that, if you have a healthy farm or a healthy orchard, will sort of be all over your leaves, eating different pests. Stoneflies, or Plecoptera, again, this is another group that develops as aquatic as the nymph stage. Fleas, or Siphonoptera. So these are an example of a highly modified insect that over time has lost a lot of the more typical insect body parts that you see, like wings. Their wings are pretty much gone. Their body shape is quite different, and they are really adapted to living on and under fur and jumping. The Ephemeroptera, which are the mayflies, they are very cool. They're another aquatic organism. And then Dermaptera, or earwigs. I think earwigs are underloved. They're one of the types of insects, one of the few types of insects that some species actually mother their young, which is really sweet. And earwig wings, if you just Google a picture, are some of the most beautiful insect wings on the planet, in my opinion. They also have sort of this leathery forewing. And when they unfold their wings, they're like this big, like the circle I'm doing. And they're like beautiful. When the light hits them, they almost look like rainbows. So the major insect orders that you folks need to learn about include the Coleoptera, the Diptera, Hemiptera, Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, Odonata, and Orthoptera. And depending on, whose research one accepts, there may be 20 to 30 additional orders. And these things shift a lot. There are systematists who sort of typically are folks that might be working like at a museum. I worked with a lot of systematists when I was doing my internship at the Smithsonian, that do lots of work identifying species in, when I was in the Smithsonian, I was just on the Hymenoptera floor, and there was millions and millions of specimens in all these drawers and these sliding cabinets. And I think they told me there was probably 1 million specimens that had been collected in the past there that the species hadn't even been identified yet. It's one of those things that's hard to get funding for basic science. So there's not that many systematists. So there's just kind of a forever potential of identifying more species. And so that is that for this presentation. Before we go into questions, I was just gonna, I was told you might find some of the things I'm doing this summer, or some of the work I do, interesting. So I'm not going to give this whole talk. This is the talk I actually gave yesterday about 2 different biological control projects I got to be involved in. So I'm going to zoom through this, but just pause at a couple slides. This is a slide I give a lot when I talk about integrated pest management and how it works. Broadly, when you are having some kind of insect problem, or you want to prevent a pest problem, you want to make sure that you have a proper identification of the species that you're working with. You're going to want to learn about things to prevent problems, monitor how progress is going in control, use action thresholds, and sometimes biological control, which is what this talk is about. I think I'm actually just going to pull up a couple slides. So one of the projects that I got to be a part of last year in Maine, this is the spotted winged Drosophila. which is an invasive species that showed up here in 2011. It's really problematic in berries. You may have heard about southern Maine, a couple of berry farms that had to close early this year because of that. Dr. Phil Fanning up at UMaine, I got to work with his lab last year. This is his lab right here, to release this wasp, Canapsus brasiliensis. Now, when I say wasp, I know that sounds scary, but this is one of these parasitoids and against a blueberry, so they're extremely small. And I got to help release them at 2 different berry farms in southern Maine. This is what 300 of those wasps looked like when I released them at the berry farm. And we put them out, and then we collected back, sort of mark and recapture sort of thing. So that was a really cool project. But the one I really wanted to talk about is I have an ongoing project I've been doing, releasing this moth species that's originally from Ukraine as a classical biological control agent against black swallowwort. Black swallowwort is an invasive species here in Maine. It's super problematic. It competes with our native vegetation, confuses monarch butterflies. It's like a cousin to milkweed. So when monarchs are looking to lay their eggs, they get confused and they think that the swallowwort is milkweed and lay their eggs, and then the caterpillars hatch, find out that they can't consume it, and then they die. And swallowwort's also toxic to livestock and damages fencing. And nothing in Maine eats swallowwort. It just has a reign over anything it wants. This is a photo. I'll kind of enlarge it so you can see better. It's a little blurry, but this shows swallowwort vines just going all over trees. So this is the life cycle of this moth. This is the 3rd year of releasing it. So first there's eggs. They hatch into teeny tiny caterpillars that are so small they can barely chew through leaves. Then those caterpillars get bigger. They eat the swallowwort plant. They are approved nationally and then within Maine for release because of other people that have done a lot more work in quarantine with these caterpillars that essentially are able to show that they only feed on swallowwort. They won't eat anything else. Then they pupate, and here in Maine, I've been able to find so far that with our kind of weather here, they'll go through a 2nd generation. So they'll do 2 cycles per year and then overwinter as the pupa. And so the process for release, typically, I receive pupa in the mail from a rearing facility. I rear them to adults in the lab in little cages. I bring those out to bigger cages that I've set up at a location. And then throughout the summer, we look at the leaves in the cages to see how the caterpillars are doing, and we look for caterpillars. And then in future years, we want to see if those moths have survived. And so we go back and we do blacklight sampling late at night to see if the moth will land on the sheet so we can say, hey, it survived the winter. And we look at the black swallowwort to figure out if over time, if it's reducing. So this was first done, these releases were first done in Ogunquit by Joan Griswold in 2018 and 2021. She's a citizen scientist who's working really hard to try to help have the marginal way in Ogunquit be all only Maine native plants. So she's trying to get rid of invasive species on marginal way. And she got to release some of these moths and did some really great first kind of gathering of information of what works and what doesn't work for releases. And then in 2022, I had 2 sites in Harpswell where I released the moths and went back and looked and did blacklight sampling in Ogunquit. In 2023, I had 4 release sites in collaboration with the South Portland Parks Department, and I went back and looked to see if the moths survived in Harpswell. So let's see if anything else. So in Ogunquit, where Joan had done the original releases, we really weren't able to show that anything had survived. But her study sort of had a few different issues that, again, we learned from and took forward with us. At our Harpswell release sites last year, we were doing the blacklight sampling, and we're really excited. Find that. Really excited to find one of the moths, which meant that it survived the winter in Harpswell. And then in South Portland last year, we had 4 sites. Things went pretty well at the 4 sites. And this year we've done blacklight sampling once in South Portland, and we didn't see any moths, but we're going back to kind of look to see what's going on. And then if this is something that I'm just going to keep getting funded every year, I get funding from USDA APHIS. I decided to sort of make it a citizen science project. So this year we are experimenting with it being citizen science. We're doing releases on Little Deer Isle. This is a photo from this year on Little Deer Isle. I did all of the steps up to releasing the moths. And then I used this piece of software called Survey 123. It's a GIS software to create a form that volunteers on Little Deer Isle are going and checking the cages for me and sending me lots of pictures in this form about what the leaves are looking like. So I don't have to drive 6 hours a week to check cages for an hour. So that's just a little bit of what I'm working on. I have lots of other projects I do, but I thought that would be a fun one to share about. All right, any questions before I stop sharing? Before I talk about your worksheets a little bit? I think I'll start just by going through the questions in the chat first, and then we can do some out loud ones too. So let's see. Are praying mantises moving further north in Maine? I don't know, but what you could do to find out is I really like iNaturalist, so you could look up praying mantises on iNaturalist. Let's see. Actually, I'll just, you can see, let's see, iNaturalist. You see my web browser? I don't hear anything. I'm taking that as a yes.
No, no, we only.
Oh,
see
okay.
you.
Okay. Let me see here. Thank you for speaking up. Oh, yeah, I really need to share my screen again. Apologies.
Right.
Okay.
There,
Thank
thanks. Yep.
So let me show you how you can use this website. So praying mantis. So I see it pop up right here, order Mantodia, view observations. Then you can go over here to filters, more filters, and you can type Maine, update search. So now we can see that there are 315 observations that have been verified here in Maine. It's really fun. You can go through and see what the photos are. And someone is asking if they're moving more north. So you can go to the map here. And if you were really curious about this, you could probably try to export the data and see the northern sites and what years those were. So like if most of the observations were down south and they were, or if like all the observations up north were only in the last 2 years, I'd probably say yes, maybe they are moving a little more north, but that's just sort of that's what I would do to try to answer that question. If I had the time to do like a full Excel export and all that, but I thought folks would like to see sort of the demo there. All right, so we talked about the ants. Are fireflies becoming a threatened species? I don't have an answer to that question. It's possible. One thing that would concern me would be light pollution. If they're not able to see each other with light pollution, that might be really problematic. Anything that helps to keep the horseflies, deerflies at bay. This is one of those tough ones where we're going into their habitat, so we're probably going to get attacked by them. I'm trying to think. Bug spray might help with horseflies and deerflies, but I'm not 100% sure. If you're ever looking for which bug spray that you want to use, I really like if you Google the EPA repellent database. EPA has this great page and a tool, search tool, that helps you with mosquitoes and ticks. But if you are looking for protection from ticks, you can fill this out and you can search, and it gives you this really nice table that shows you the different products that you can purchase the hourly protection. So if you buy this, for example, bug block sunscreen and insect repellent, it's going to protect you for 1 hour from mosquitoes, 1 hour for ticks. The active ingredient is citronella. But if you want more hours of protection, let's see, if you want 8 hours of protection or 7 hours, you might want to get something that has this catnip oil or DEET. So anyhow, DEET will give you different amounts of protection. So anyhow, I just thought that if it's sort of a repellent question, I think that this is a really great database. Does a dragonfly nymph differ from a damsel nymph? Yes. So dragonfly versus damselfly nymph. I'll show you a photo comparison. So here on the left, what's happening? I zoomed in, that didn't work. Let me visit this page. So here on the left is a dragonfly nymph. They're very sort of short and stout, kind of chunky. Damselfly nymphs often are a little bit more long and slender. And if you can kind of think about, these are the incomplete metamorphosis, so that the babies look more like the adults. So dragonflies are much thicker, as are their nymphs, and the damselflies are a little bit more dainty. Does anyone from MNAP want to answer how MNAP chose the orders to focus on?
We have a curriculum committee that does that. So there's a curriculum committee, and when you graduate, we always need volunteers to help the program. So if you're interested in the curriculum committee, let us know. And Claire Cole is actually the head of the curriculum committee, so you can talk to Claire about that and ask her. I don't know if Claire's here. I don't think she is.
She said she was going to be late.
Right, she could tell us, but the coordinators don't decide. It's the curriculum committee of the huge organization that we are. Thank you.
Great. All right, so measures being taken to control emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, brown tail moth. So these types of invasive and problematic species are often attacked from many angles. So on sort of the state end of things, the state of Maine, we have the Maine Forest Service, which works on the forest pests, and then the DEP has some folks, Inland Fisheries and Wildlife has some folks, and then we have folks in the plant health programs as well, the CAPS, the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey program. So I'm housed within the plant health programs in the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. So I'm the IPM specialist, and then we have the CAPS program, Karen Caluzzi. She deals with a lot of invasive species, so she has monitoring traps all over the state that she checks every year for different insect pests and invasive species. People also submit any potential invasive species sightings to her. And then we have 2 assistant state horticulturalists who go to all of the nurseries every year and inspect them for an invasive species and check that they're having good practices. And then we also have a state apiarist who works with honeybees, what is the name of someone who keeps honeybees? Beekeepers. Sorry. So that's sort of broadly, across the state. Although, my boss, Gary Fish, who's the state horticulturalist, he's been working on trying to put some bills in to get more funding and more positions when it comes to invasive insects. And then, some on the state, but more heavily on the university end of things for most invasive species. There's a lot of work that goes into researching all the different avenues of the biology of an invasive species and different biocontrols and different fungal controls and setting up IPM programs. I'll just show you from my PhD experience. Let me close this. Sorry. I was part of a big team of people who are working on the brown marmorated stink bug, and they have this website that they put together. But I just thought one thing that's really cool to see here is these are all the different universities that had multiple professors in this big Stop Brown Marmorated Stink Bug working group, coordinating their research so that, you know, the stink bug was such a big problem. In 2015, the population just exploded in the United States, and lots of growers like lost their orchards. It was really horrible. But all these different universities came together, all the professors, to figure out the research that needed to happen right away to help the growers and to not like have two people working on the same project, to basically move things forward. And it's more under control these days. And now this website is a great resource that growers can go to learn lots of different things. There's all these free resources. So for most insects, let's see, you asked about Asian long, so if I Google Maine, Asian longhorn beetle, it'll pull up the caps. So I talked about Karen Paluzzi. She's my coworker. So this is her page about Asian longhorn beetle that she's pulled together. She's got maps, she's got identification guides, she's got lookalikes, so the different beetles that people sometimes get confused with them, tons of resources. And I know that Asian longhorn beetle has had so much research. Here's the UMaine Cooperative Extension page on it. So that's a broad answer to that question. All right, so that's all of the chat questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. Does anyone have any other questions? All right, hearing none, I'm gonna just present again let's see.
There was one more about what cicadas do underground.
Oh, I missed that one, didn't I? Back to Zoom. I don't have an answer to that, but I was actually, it was funny. I was literally driving and thinking about it the other day. I'm like, why do they do that? It's most likely to avoid overlapping with other cicadas at the same time. So, you know, if you have everything, all different species all emerging at once, there might be some confusion on finding a mate and having enough resources. So it probably evolutionarily had to do with they're such big insects, they probably need to really slowly eat what they eat underground, and then B, not overlapping with other insects. So I think you wanted, did I talk about the mouth parts? Or you wanted me to go through this mouth parts PDF? Is that what it
Yeah,
was?
the PDF that they have, which
Okay.
has a lot of words on it.
Okay, great. So let me
Look at that. Thanks.
share my screen again. Okay. Okay. So this is a PDF that you should have. The first page has some blanks that should be filled in for what these types of mouth parts are. The second page is showing some different examples of different insect mouth parts and how broken down they can be. So I believe this is the head of a mosquito right here, showing the antenna, the labium, which is a long piercing mouth part, the maxillary palps, which oftentimes in mosquitoes are kind of almost used like a leg for balance, the mandible and the maxilla. I can't really remember how everything happens, but there's sort of a sawing motion. Some parts kind of get through the skin, the next parts kind of hold it open, while the other, usually I think the labrum goes into the vein. Another type of sucking mouth part is a butterfly here. They keep it curled up, and there's going to be a food channel where they kind of suck up through. And then again, we've got a labial palp. So you see here on the mosquito, the palps are sort of secondary mouth parts that are oftentimes used for stabilization or holding things. This is, let me zoom in a little, a breakdown from the front and the side of a fly with a sponging mouth part. And so this is the front of the face. You probably don't need to know all of these terms, but this is the front of the face of this fly. This is little teeny antenna. The clipius, which is sort of the top of the mouth. The vibrissae, these are two hairs. They're most likely used for sensing movement. Flies are covered in hairs because if you've ever tried to swat a fly, you'll see that it senses that you're coming before you hit it. That's because these hairs will move as the wind moves, and that's how they fly away. Those palps on this, and then that sponging mouth part is called the labellum. So that's that from the side. It comes down a proboscis. So proboscis is the term for sort of what the mouth parts come down on. And this is an earwig. So they are going to be chewing insects. So here's the front of the face. They kind of look like aliens. There's the compound eye, the antenna, and then the mouth parts include the maxilla, which is sort of a chewing part. The maxillary palps, again, the palps are almost like little legs that are typically used for holding food or stabilization. And then the labial palp, the labrum, and the mandible. So mandibles are for chewing, and then these are just sort of there to help push things up as the chewing happens. Here's a beetle that's been dissected out to show the different mouth parts. So again, here's the head of the, oh yeah, you can see my mouse. Here's the head of the beetle with eyes and antenna. The labrum, which is, I guess, kind of like the lip, I guess, would be a way of describing it. Mandibles are sharp and piercing and chewing. The hypopharynx is sort of within, it has to get pulled out, kind of like a tongue, I guess. And then again, those palps, the labium and the maxilla, which are kind of like, you can think of them as mini legs that kind of grab things and move them up. And again, a grasshopper, so again, mandibles because they chew. The maxilla, which are those secondary sort of almost like little legs, and the labium as well. And then the labrum, sort of like the lip. So there are the mouth parts. And then I had opened, I must have closed it on accident. Are they up here?
Right, and then we were given this particular key to look at.
Yes, let me try to
So-
get that open again.
I think it's like a visual key, right? So,
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the key. So
And you're not sharing, you're still sharing
Oh,
mouth
thank
part
you.
screen. Thank you.
Okay, so are folks familiar with using keys?
We do have lessons on that, but
Okay.
yes, we should be familiar. Yes.
So when you're looking at an insect, you'll start at the top here. And this is just one key. I'm just going to go to, there's many pages. This is just the key to the order of adult insects. And this is just, one way of breaking them out, but a really good one for this course. I remember last year I did the Auburn course and we brought this key out with us to the field and we were able to use it. So I'm going to zoom in a bit so it's easier to read as we go down through. So at the beginning, when you have an insect, it first splits out to if it's a winged or wingless. I'm going to pick one and just go down. So say it's a winged insect. Then the next split out will be either that the front wings are membranous. So if you remember, membranous means like a dragonfly is a good way of thinking of it. It's soft, it's a membrane, it's very fragile, versus the front wings being hardened, leathery, or parchment-like, at least at the base. So at least at the base is sort of referring to, remember we were looking at the stink bug and how it had the first half of that wing was leathery and then the membrane at the bottom. So if it was membranous fully, you'd go to page 61, or you'd move on if it was hardened. Then it splits out into chewing mouth parts or sucking mouth parts. We'll go down chewing. Then it has, you look at the back side. So does it have pincer-like cerci? Cerci being those, I called cerci sort of the butt antenna. If it does have those, you've got an earwig. Earwigs are unique in that they have over time evolved that they're cerci, instead of just being sensing organisms, are actually typically males will use these in displays. Females will kind of protect their young with them. Earwigs don't actually go into your ears. That's an urban legend. If they don't have the pincer-like cerci, Then the next question is, are the front wings with branched veins, or are the front wings hard without veins? So if they're hard like a rock, they're going to be beetles. If they are more veinous, then it splits into walking or jumping insects. So if you see here, it's showing legs with a hind femur. This is where knowing the terminology for the different pieces of the legs come into play. Hind femur that's going to be really thick and enlarged, or it's not. It's enlarged in jumping insects because it has lots more muscles, so that way they can jump. So you'll have your orthopterans. If not, you've made it all the way down to the order Dictyoptera, which are roaches, mantids, and walking sticks. You can go back in time a little bit up here. Here's an example of, these used to be two orders, Hemiptera and Homoptera. So this key was published before they were brought back together into one group, but it's not a huge deal. That's more of a like, oh, well, scientifically, actually, it's this. But, you know, and when you're out doing a project in the field and you just are doing a key, it's not a huge deal that it splits these out. Is that good for showing kind of how this key works?
I think so, yes, and I like the idea about using it in the field. We'll have our field day in August.
Yep.
And so we'll use this and you know, let's try to figure out some of the orders at that time. So that's great. Any other questions about the key? All right, well, Hillary, thank you. That was like a complete, yeah, it was really nice that you could come and tell us
have one-
that
We
stuff.
have one other question on the,
Oh, yeah. Are sponging and lapping insects in the same group? No. So, oh, I see what you're saying. I think let me look back at the slide where I talked about the mouth parts. Yes. This mouth part morphology, it's lapping and sponging are in the same group, but it is sort of it's similar but different. But yes, per the homework, yes, it's lapping. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I appreciated your attention. I hope you had fun, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
thank
Okay,
you.
Bye.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Right.
you.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm gonna stop the recording now, so we can, like, somewhere here.